Welcome back to this beautiful day in the hub of the universe. It's been interesting to see that you could say the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is figuring it out with the MBTA Communities Act. California is figuring it out. Montana is figuring it out. What we're about to learn is that really Detroit is figuring it out. And our next session on tax policy, we are joined by Jay Rising, the Chief Financial Officer for the City of Detroit, Nick Allen from MIT, Joan Youngman from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and former Boston Chief Assessor Ron Rakow, who's also a fellow at the Lincoln Institute. This session will be moderated by Dillon from the LA Times. So over to you, Liam.
Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. This is going to be fun, talking about taxes. So Jay, I'm going to just jump right in here and start with you. Can you tell me what Detroit is doing as it relates to its tax system, and why is it doing it now?
Happy to. Let me take this from you. That's great. First of all, I feel a little bit of the imposter here. I'm just the attorney in the room with economists and public policy experts. As an attorney, Nick came up with this idea a few years ago before I became Chief Financial Officer. I was the one that said, no, you can't do that. Nice idea, Nick. But as we worked on this, I want to talk a little bit more, what is Detroit? Because it helps you understand the value of this proposal for the city. It's very different characteristics than what we've heard from panelists otherwise. We're not doing this because we need to place EDUs in backyards. We're doing this because we have too many backyards. So, if I can get the right way. Oh, the wrong way. So Detroit is 138 square miles. It's like we like to say, Manhattan, San Francisco, and Boston can fit into it, and we leave some room for some more cities. If you think about Baltimore, Philadelphia, that's about the size. And in terms of population, we're, depending on whether you ask the Census Bureau or the mayor, we're about 640, 650,000 people, about the same size as Baltimore. But of these 88,000 acres we have, 17% of the acreage is vacant. About 110,000 parcels, half of which in public ownership and half of which in private ownership. A substantial part of the city. In the last 10 years, the city's land bank, which accumulates tax foreclosed upon parcels, has sold off almost 28,000 structures and 23,000 side lots. So this has been really the first part of the strategy. Let's take property and put it in the hands of people, sidelines, who want this property next to theirs and have some ownership interest in it. Let's take properties that are structures and rehabilitate what we can, sell them for people for very low prices to be able to, with agreements that you continue the renovations and live in the property for 3 years and give them a small tax break during that process. Let's take properties which are needs to be demolished and do that. We issued a $250 million bond to be able to pay for that for properties held publicly. So we have whittled down the amount of vacant properties, the amount of properties that need to be demolished, and coupled that with a lot of blight remediation to do the first thing you have to do, I think, in this process is stabilize the city. So the second thing is we have to really provide some support for the residents of the city. So this is someplace people can live and feel like this is a place where they have amenities. I mean, we have increased more officers. We're at a 50-year low, trending for homicides in the city this year. We reopened 275 parks, which were closed during the bankruptcy. We've increased 10,000 new housing units. We're investing $170 million of ARPA money in housing, affordable housing, rental assistance, eviction control, eviction prevention, repairs, every aspect of housing, homelessness, and the first thing actually the mayor did when he came in, he turned on streetlights. He replaced streetlights in the whole city just to have lights in people's neighborhoods. All these things make the difference of whether you're going to want to stay in your property or move out, whether people come to the city. So that our second step, and we've done this, and we continue to do it, is this effort of supporting people's lives in the city. So the third effort really now is to address the problem, which really has created some of this. And in the city, owners of unprotectable land pay very little property taxes. That building you see, apartment building, which is deteriorated and vacant, last year paid $160. The little house next door paid $567. So what you really do happens in the city is that you are rewarded for not investing in your property because the property taxes will go down and you can afford to maintain that property. If we end up with situations where we're acquiring property in the second picture, we just have a lot of land. It's hard to develop because the tax system is so high. It's higher than one of the highest in the state and the highest of the surrounding area. So what the consequence of this high taxes and lots of land is we have speculation. So 10 private owners hold over 250 empty parcels. This is what we call the land lottery in the city. Invest in 100, 200 parcels, hopefully when, you close your number. And there's a scientist plant, a GM expansion, a Ford development, something will go in your neighborhood and you make up all the money plus it's your ticket. But it also spreads vacant land, which has no interest in being developed because it's so cheap. It's $50 a year to hold the property and values the property very well. Second problem is unproductive use. There are more scrapyards in the city than all the surrounding area combined. 400 of them, 20 new permitted, a dozen more permits without permits since 2012 alone. And it's just like easy, there's lots of land. It's undeveloped land, it attracts that type of businesses. And the third is there's no new investment, or very limited new investment into the city. Only 500 homes in the last 12 years have been built in the city of Detroit. So city council, using the only tool they had about 10, 15 years ago, created something called neighborhood enterprise zones with legislature's approval. The city is now spotted about 10% of the city, that's the cap you can have, with what we call neighborhood enter zones, or called land value tax light. It's an abatement program for homesteads. The problem with it, it's 15 years long, and so the value of it goes to the owner, and that was probably the intent to do that. Let's make sure that people in the most highly valued area of the city don't move out. Because that would affect our residential income tax and would affect the land values of those properties, which are the highest in the city. The highest areas in the city have gotten a tax abatement, and typical tax abatement ways, lowering the improvement value and taxing the land. But it only goes for 15 years, so it goes to the value of the owner presently, and it's baked in the price that they want to sell it. There are 30,000 NEZs, only 900 people actually enroll in them, so people don't even know about it. And you have to go through a whole effort to get your tax code. And most importantly, it's a very inequitable system. Who is going to and how many people can receive it isn't the fairest way to do this. So our solution, we thought, is a land value tax. And our goals, relieve the tax burdens on residential property, disincentivize speculation and unproductive use of land, incentivize investment and lower the barriers to entry for people coming into the city so that we're at the average tax rate of the surrounding area. And one of the goals for us was don't use abatement programs, use it as your system of collection of taxes. Try to protect public revenues and public services by making it fairly revenue neutral. And that's how we got to where we are today.
So we're going to go kind of specific with Detroit and then kind of up broader as well. And Nick, I want to ask you, can you put what Jay said in context in terms of explaining to us the essential idea of a land value tax and why proponents hope it will spur development?
Sure, yeah. Once I can get my mic on. Yeah, thanks, Liam. I want to back up a little bit too and just provide some regional context. Michigan is enormously challenged in maintaining and recruiting population over time. That's a conversation that the state is having. That's meant that the Detroit metropolitan area has about 1.7 million people today and had about 1.7 million people in 1980. So it's roughly flat, right? It's not the worst thing. What's surprising about that, right, is that Detroit has lost about half its population during that time, and has lost, on average, about 4,000 units of housing a year, while 7,500 units are built in the rest of the region. Right? So in some sense, there's this problem of capital flight causing a process of blight in the city. And the really important question to ask about there, right, is why would that happen? What are the incentives that are pushing capital investment out of the city and removing homes from the city over time? It's a really important equity question, right? Because if you have a very racially segregated region, what that means is that housing wealth in the city of Detroit, anybody who's maintaining and improving property there and maintaining, say, generational family assets, is losing wealth relative to those options to move outside the city. And that needs to be addressed. Arthur was talking earlier today about the problem of black middle class flight in Detroit since really around since 2005 or so. And making sure that people feel that they are rewarded for staying in the city is a fundamental challenge for the city and a really important thing to tackle. So why is it happening? I think there are a couple different reasons you could look at that. You could look at problems of like overbuilding infrastructure in Southeast Michigan. But a really important part of that is that Detroiters are paying the highest property tax rates in the nation, particularly on the housing investments that they own. It's about twice to 3 times as high as the rest of the region. And that means that over time, imagine if interest rates were that different, right? Imagine if your interest rate in a suburb outside of Detroit was 2 to 3 times lower relative to your interest rate in Detroit. Well, property taxes would have a very similar effect, right? What you would expect is that housing units would get built in that lower interest rate environment. So I think backing up a little bit here, the really important thing about a land value tax is untaxing other types of resources that cities want. A land value tax, in some ways, is just a neutral tax. It's what some economists have called the least bad tax, right? It taxes an asset that doesn't move. That when you tax it, it doesn't chase that asset away, and it raises revenue from the types of services that cities are providing to each individual unit in the family, or each individual unit in the jurisdiction. So there's some really desirable features of a land value tax relative to taxes on any other type of resource. And that's, I think, the crux of this idea, right, is there a way that Detroit can raise revenue that support the type of services that residents want without overburdening housing, without overburdening new investment, and that would also bring down the fiscal penalties that Detroiters have faced for continuing to maintain and build up the city.
Joan, what lessons do you think the debate that's going on in Detroit and Michigan hold for other cities that are concerned about housing affordability?
Well, in a number of ways, the lessons of Detroit in seeing the potential of a land tax have implications for property taxes everywhere. The property tax has a land tax component. That's not all. It also has a building tax component. But we tax many things in addition to land. We tax income, we tax sales, we tax transfers, we tax estates, and we tax buildings. But we have a land value tax. And as Jay and Nick have said, a land tax has special efficiency and equity benefits. It does not discourage production, and it reaches the bare land value represents really a social good. If you have a piece of bare land in the middle of Manhattan, you have wealth, but not because of anything you did. It's because society has grown and there's demand around you. And so that particular form of wealth is actually appropriate for thinking about things like value capture initiatives. If public services or public investment raise land values, the land value is an appropriate revenue source to help fund those public activities. So that's why we think the property tax, the standard property tax, even without a change to land value tax or different rates, is very much worth supporting and defending and encouraging to keep values up to date. Another aspect to think about here with respect to housing is the effect of capitalization. That is, what is the influence of the tax on values, on what you pay? And here the classic example is Concord and Bow in New Hampshire. Concord is the state capital. It has a lot of service responsibilities. It has a lot of exempt property. It has high tax rates. Bow is right next door. It's semi-rural. It doesn't have many responsibilities. And it has a power plant that pays a lot of its taxes. So it has low tax rates. And there are areas where it's just one street. One side is Concord, one side is Bow. And areas where the same developer built the same houses on either side. And they even share a school district. So not surprisingly, the people who are buying the houses with the higher taxes pay less than the people across the street who are buying identical houses with lower taxes. But if you put it together, so what is your mortgage payment and what are your tax payments over the course of a year, they're paying the same amount. The buyer has capitalized the tax responsibility into the payment for the house. And this can get very big. And two economists, Roy Ball and Johannes Lind, who are on our board of directors, they once wrote, "An equity argument may be at the heart of the matter. Urban land prices are frequently so high that low-income groups cannot afford to purchase land. To the extent that the property tax is capitalized into current values, it constitutes a loan to future owners who can acquire the land at a lower price but will have to pay property taxes in the future." So capitalization is like a mortgage. It reduces your initial outlay, but you pay it back over time. But a mortgage that you don't have to apply for, and it's available to anyone, and you don't need a down payment. And this very month at the annual meeting of the National Tax Association, researchers from New York University presented work showing that older purchasers who might not be at their peak earning years anymore, but who might have accumulated wealth, they would prefer to pay a higher price up front and lower taxes during their period of ownership. Whereas for younger purchasers who are not accumulating wealth yet, but are coming into their high earning years, are just the opposite. So, this theoretical effect of acting like a mortgage has an impact. And finally, I would just say a word about tax incentives and disincentives for development. All of us far away, we are always fascinated by California and perplexed. And one thing that was particularly perplexing was when San Francisco became the first jurisdiction to have an urban agriculture program, where if you agreed to, I'll say garden, because this could be as little as 1/10 of an acre, and that just seems, agriculture seems a little grandiose. For 5 years, then it wasn't an exemption, but it was a valuation so low, it was a practical exemption. The San Francisco Chronicle did a story, a landowner who had a $2 million lot, and by saying he would grow things on it for 5 years, the value for tax purposes was $12,500 an acre. So, the importance of keeping the need for housing, affordability, the need all in play at the same time when you're looking at these different goods. Thanks.
Before I jump to you, Ron, I just want to perhaps ground us a little bit better with Jay or Nick. Can you explain the specific proposal? So it would increase the tax on the land portion, decrease it on the structure, and what's sort of is there a revenue impact? Just some of those kind of details I think would help ground us here a little better.
I'll try and not make it gory in details, but effectively, yes, that describes it well. There's a property tax that applies to buildings and land. What we want to do is take down the rate on buildings in particular, or take down the rate on all property, and replace those revenues with a land value tax. So in total, it's basically revenue neutral. As we've, there will be changes over time. Those tax bases will grow differently over time. But the goal is to make sure that every dollar that you take off of property, you are putting a dollar of tax on land throughout the city.
Okay, Ron, can you speak to some of the ways in which diverse and disparate property tax laws work on the ground, specifically how they may result in equities, in inequities between owners depending on the property they own, when they bought their property, or other reasons?
Sure. Actually, property taxes have been in the news a little bit in the last couple of years, and channeling my former life as an assessing commissioner, that's never a good thing. But there's been several national studies actually that use nationwide data, and they have found widespread regressiveness in assessments across the whole United States. The study that's probably gotten the most play is one by Chris Berry of the University of Chicago. And he analyzed 26 million sales, I believe it was, over 2,600 counties, and found this widespread regressivity. And that's certainly very concerning to everyone, including people in the assessing profession. Barry actually has a website at the University of Chicago, which is excellent, by the way, and he actually provides in addition to his national study, he provides details for each county. So since I was in Suffolk County, Massachusetts for a number of years, I decided to do my own analysis and compare it to his, because there's so much nuance and complexity in the property tax structure. You have different rates, different exemption programs and whatnot. So trying to do it and distill it nationally is a very difficult thing to do. So I thought maybe by just looking at a jurisdiction I was familiar with, I would get a little bit better sense of what's going on. And I'll also say that generally speaking, Massachusetts is maybe a little bit more advanced and diligent in terms of keeping its assessments up to date than some other states, because one of the sources of inequity is when you don't revalue your property for long periods of time, and the market changes, and that can result in a lot of inequity. And I think that's what some of these national studies were finding. But in Suffolk County, I actually came up with similar results to what Barry did when he just looked at the assessments. I found a little bit less regressivity than he did, but basically the lower, and when we talk about regressivity in the property tax, we're talking about lower priced properties paying a higher effective tax rate than higher priced properties. So we had, I'm going to do my imaginary PowerPoint here. So we basically had a line where there was just a slight level of regressivity. And I found this really to be very disturbing, and also it didn't make sense to me, because one of the things that we have in Boston is a homestead exemption, and a very generous homestead exemption. And the way homestead exemptions work is if you do it as a flat dollar amount, it has a much greater benefit to lower priced properties than higher priced properties. So if you have a $2,500 or $25,000 exemption, let's say, if you have a $250,000 home, that's a 10% reduction. If you have $1 million home, it's only a 2.5% reduction. So it's a way to make property taxes more progressive. So when I actually included the impact of the exemption, I found just the opposite that what Barry found. In fact, that property taxes in Suffolk County were very progressive. The lower priced properties were paying about 0.5% in an effective tax rate, and the higher priced properties were paying about 1%. So to me, a very important lesson in this is that, well, I think the assessment profession needs to probably look at their evaluation techniques and get at this regressivity. We do have policy tools at our disposal, like homestead exemptions, that can really guide the incidence of the property tax and make it either proportional or even progressive. And I think that's very important. And I think at the Lincoln Institute, Joan and Adam Langley had done a very good policy focus report on residential property tax relief. And in there they talk about targeted property tax relief, because we're always trying to balance, wanting to maintain revenues for local governments, at the same time making sure that people can afford their property taxes, because that is, in the end, a very important component of housing affordability. So, we like targeted techniques like circuit breakers, which, based on, will provide relief based on the income of the taxpayer. And homestead exemptions, as I said, with a flat dollar amount, where it can really make property taxes more affordable for taxpayers that are in lower, moderate income categories. And finally, when it comes to equity, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about one of my favorite topics, which is our assessment caps. Because they are probably the worst tools that are out there when you're looking at equity. Because what we're doing with assessment caps is we're basically taking property owners that are have very rapidly rising values and are seeing a big increase in their equity, are being subsidized by taxpayers that have very low values, or maybe have values that are only increasing a little bit, which is really kind of a counterintuitive situation. And also, the dirty little secret with assessment caps is that far more people pay more in taxes than they would if there were no cap at all. Some of the studies I've seen is 75 to 80% of the people are actually paying more under an assessment cap than they would if there were no cap at all. So, if you see proposals like that coming up in some of your states and cities, we have a lot of great literature on the topic, but in terms of tax equity, it's really important to avoid that and really have a good, solid assessment system where assessments are kept up to date, and with targeted exemption programs to make sure that we're only giving relief where needed and ensuring that we're having adequate revenues for our communities.
So if only that assessment cap literature were available to the voters of California in, say, 1978, perhaps we have a different outcome with Prop 13. So I want to push on this issue to try to get some of the practical impacts or effects of what Detroit's proposing, or what it hopes it will be, to come out a little more. And you already said, Nick, that this isn't predominantly a revenue play, right? So if it's not that, if Detroit were to do this, and this is open to everybody, how would we know whether it's working or not?
Thanks. I actually think getting that benchmark right is really important. So I think there's a couple things. We did a study on this with the Lincoln Institute, which many people in the room participated in. But I can say that we noted a couple of things about cities that have adopted these types of split rate systems. Pennsylvania has done this for about 100 years now, with a very similar type of system. The biggest things that you can say is that what you would expect under a lower tax on buildings and a higher tax on land is more buildings in the city. What we found is a substantial growth in business formation, a higher aggregate amount of residential market value, and a higher amount of commercial market value in those cities. So I would say to some extent, we should expect more building than the baseline to happen in Detroit. But I think maybe the most important thing to think about there is the baseline, right? The most important thing that Detroit can do right now is stabilize existing housing stock, to make sure people have access to repair loans, that conventional financing is working, that there are more than 1,000 mortgages a year being issued in the city. And a really important part of reducing the property tax in a city with a very high property tax rate is allowing for those types of lending and normal activities that happen at scale to happen in the housing market. So I think the baseline for me is that there is greater stability in neighborhoods, and maybe some additional effect on stimulating investment in some of the higher growth areas of the city.
Can you just a little more on the stability in neighborhoods? Can you kind of talk a little more about how that would occur, or why that would occur?
Sure. I think right now there's a couple. Imagine yourself being a home buyer in the Detroit region, right? You're looking at a couple different factors. Can I finance this property? What is the long-term tax payment that I'm making on this property relative to the services that I get? What do I expect to happen with the value of this property and the value of services available in the city? Right now, I think the odds are kind of stacked against a lot of legacy cities on those counts. The goal here is that you can do two things to make that better. One is you can increase the value of services in the area, which is what Jay spoke to. But the other thing you can do, and it's an important consideration, right, is you can reduce the amount that you're paying in exchange for that bundle of services. And doing that across the city is a really important way to make people decide that Detroit is a good place to live. It's a good way to get banks to recognize that there's effectively cash flow, or that homeowners have residual value that they're willing to pay for the property. it's a way to get out of those out of the way of those activities that are happening in other jurisdictions in Michigan.
So follow up to the question I had for Joan, but this again can be for everybody. I want to, most of us are not from Detroit here. What is the broader applicability of this kind of tax system or this kind of structure? Some of the reasons why Detroit is pursuing it sounds like maybe makes sense for Detroit or are unique to Detroit. So what lessons does this have for other places?
Well, I could say two things. One is that the benefits of a land tax are available when you have a land tax, even if it's part of a property tax. The two-rate tax in Pittsburgh was studied by a lot of economists, and what they concluded was it wasn't that the land tax itself had some magical effect to help the city's renaissance. It was that the alternative ways of raising revenue were so bad for business development. You may know, like, Philadelphia has a wage tax. Oh, and there are so many big law firms, places that should be right downtown, right under William Penn's hat, and they're right across the border. They're in some unpronounceable suburb because they don't pay the taxes. They've lost thousands and thousands of jobs. So to have a tax that does no harm, is really huge. And the second thing is this idea of the difficulty of tracking values for very low price property. When we're talking about there might not be a standard mortgage market, there might not be the same number of arm's length sales. There might be a big influence of interior conditions that the assessor doesn't get to see. There might be elements like crime rates and school quality that do not enter the models that they use. A lot of assessors are reluctant to put huge amounts of resources into trying to get a better handle on the values of a part of the base that don't produce much revenue. So this is where something like the homestead exemption that Ron is talking about can be a huge help. If it's in dollar terms and not as a percentage, it will have a bigger impact at the lower end of the price scale. And so that can help address this problem of persistent regressivity.
If I can just add too, I don't think I would implement the exact model we proposed in Detroit anywhere else, but I agree with Joan that a land value tax is a good tax for general purposes because it really recycles revenue. It has very low incidence on low-income households. It's a really good way not to tax other things that cities want. I think the important question here is really about what do you fund with that tax? And what you want to fund is the thing that makes the largest coalition of people who feel like this is a good tax to have in the city. In Detroit, it's great that 97% of homeowners save automatically by reducing property taxes with the land value tax. I don't think that would necessarily be true, and certainly as we've played this out in other jurisdictions in Michigan, not other people don't want that option, and I think that has to do with that the coalition isn't quite the same. So, I would look at things like, can you use a land value tax to fund a more generous homestead exemption? Can you use it to fund transit services that are really needed in places, especially given that land values are very high around transit stations, and that this wouldn't discourage more investment there? I think it would need a lot of flexibility on pairing this idea of funding things with land value tax with decisions about what to fund.
I'm going to ask one or two more questions, then I'm going to open it up. Joan, you brought up Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh doesn't have the land value tax that it did anymore. Why doesn't this method of taxation, if everyone's talking about how great it is, why doesn't this method exist on a widespread basis? And maybe you can include why Pittsburgh abandoned it.
Yeah, Pittsburgh is a great example. Different states have different amounts of state level oversight of local assessors and local taxation. And Pennsylvania is at one end of the spectrum with no oversight at all. And there are counties there that have not revalued in decades and decades. And Allegheny County, it's always easier to just leave the values on the books until you get to a point where somebody complains and a court orders a revaluation because you're violating the uniformity clause or some other legal requirement. And that's what happened. And then you have a revaluation with huge shifts in value. And all of a sudden you have winners and losers. And in that environment, everything was on the table and everything had to change. So it's part of the essential infrastructure of a value-based tax to keep the values up to date, to continually make small adjustments. And the lesson going back to Prop 13, be willing to reduce your rates when you have a period of very high increasing values. In California in the 70s, the local governments were afraid. They knew that there would be some school finance cases coming down. They didn't know what kind of revenue needs they might have. But that is just an invitation to a tax revolt and to moving away from a value-based tax. So I think anything having to do with real estate has a long timeline because it's a long-term investment. And so taking a incremental step, moving in a direction always makes sense, but also incrementally every year adjusting the values so that you never get into this situation where you're forced to upend all sorts of expectations and you have a tax revolt.
Liam, if I could just add one other practical consideration that might be a hindrance to a land value tax elsewhere. Detroit's curse is also its blessing when it comes to having a lot of vacant lots, which means you have a lot of vacant land sales, which you can then use to come up with reliable land values if you're an assessor. But if you're in Boston or Cambridge or a densely populated area where you don't have a lot of developable parcels, there's not really a good basis to come up with the land value. We have a lot of sales of real estate with land and buildings, but very seldom do you have enough land sales to really draw conclusions about what land is worth. So that can also be a barrier. Good news though, we at the Lincoln Institute, we actually had 10 academics working with us a couple of years ago, and we gave them data from Maricopa County, which had some land sales, but is a mostly pretty well-developed area. And we're exploring some techniques to really kind of get at that issue, and we're going to be working on a phase 2 of that, hopefully in this coming year. So there still needs to be some work done, but that can be a practical consideration that can be a barrier.
One more thing then on the practicality, Joan, you referenced winners and losers. Again, I keep thinking, of course, of California and someone who bought a house in 1975 paying property taxes still based on the value of their house from 1975. The idea of changing the property tax structure such that they may ultimately be paying values for 2023, it just seems so politically impossible. We just had a vote where we wouldn't even tax a commercial rate at a commercial property at its market rate. And I know California is maybe extreme, but not alone in having these sorts of restrictions. So, to what extent politically do you think any of these changes, again, barring Detroit right now, is something that's actually even reasonable to think about?
Well, I do think that the California case shows that when you put in a limit like an assessment limit, it really is generally a one-way street. To undo a limit and go back to market value is such a difficult political situation. Very few places have ever done it. And it's one reason why Ron says, we really feel assessment limits do the worst damage to assessment equity. But there can always be moves in the right direction. And one of the moves in the right direction is accurate valuation. Places that haven't kept their values up to date can go in and have more accurate land and building values. And we know that when areas are under a lot of buying activity, it's the land, it's not the bricks and mortar, it's the location. And there are many places that have phased in new values, not doing all at one time. But that would not require a a new law or a change in the tax system. But this makes me think of Chicago, which had a 7% solution, and they put it in for just a few years. Residential property could only go up 7% a year. And they thought this was just a wonderful way to publicize it. It's our 7% solution. And some of our colleagues at University of Illinois wrote an article in the National Tax Journal, and they pointed out that this phrase, 7% solution, came from Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes in the original novels was a cocaine addict. And he injected himself with a and at one point he says to doctor, would you like some? It's a 7% solution. And so they said, these special provisions have an addictive quality. You do one, it raises another problem, and you have to do one down the road.
We'll open it up. No, yeah.
A couple questions. One is, it seems like folks in blighted neighborhoods with lots of vacant lots would be backers of this. I just wonder what the pushback has been, if any, from like Detroit's more affluent neighborhoods like downtown or Indian Village. And then two, my understanding is that Detroit had done previous things like selling off side lots and stuff to residents for like $100 and things like that. Things that allowed people in those neighborhoods to expand the land they own for very little. Folks who took advantage of those programs, are they gonna feel like there was a bait and switch here? Now they were expanded their lots very quickly and easily. Now they're gonna be having to pay for them in a way they didn't have to on the front end.
It's as if you were sitting in our chairs. Those are the exact discussions. I mean, one, as I showed, the more wealthy areas had tax abatement already. They have almost exactly what the tax cut that we're offering for the whole city, about 17% on average cut. But it became, as we had this discussion, the question of, well, you know, I wanna make sure if it's 1% more, I wanna keep that, so we let them keep it. But then we basically said, you're gonna extend that, so we've made some protections, you're guaranteed your NEZ, you're guaranteed your tax won't go up, and you'll be continued on indefinitely without any application. The side lots were a surprise problem a little bit, shouldn't have been, but we've sold 23,000 side lots. We had to put a special provision in there that basically said, your 4 side lots, up to 4 side lots, will assure that those taxes won't go up with your homestead. Now, in reality, the cut of the 17% on the homestead itself, because of the low value of land of the side lots, will still produce a cut for them. So in very little cases, if we're ever gonna have a situation where the increase of tax on the side lots will cause the overall 4 or 5 parcels to go up. But that protection became a very important thing. Just to kind of carry on the discussion of a little story a little bit about unexpected consequences and events that happen when you propose something. And people have talked about this a little bit. Urban farming became a very big issue in Detroit. It has, because of the large amount of land and the land being given to people for public use, every neighborhood created a community garden along their side lots. They accumulated land and created urban farms. That became a fairly important political voice that we had to make sure that urban farms were basically exempt unless under the FORM system. So there are, whenever you do a massive restructuring of tax policy in a community, you're going to find the one-offs issues that you have to address, and those are a few of them.
Are you going to be able to actually, thank you. Are you going to be able to actually claw back this tax money from these absentee property owners? I mean, do they pay taxes now?
It's $25 a lot. It is, they don't want to lose a lot because one of them is going to be the lottery ticket that they're going to cash in, and they don't know which one. So that 2,500 lots are all paying taxes. Now, there's been questions to us that said, well, if you raise your taxes to $60, will they walk away when you'd be flooded with more land? I don't think the increase is substantial enough to make that decision. That's.
The other thing I think about, I should also plug, I think Henry wrote a great book called Paved Paradise that everybody should check out on some of these questions about land valuation and how cities can grow. I just want to say I think it's actually really important to reduce the building rate as it's a potential solution to make sites more attractive. So I don't think that a $25 lot in the neighborhoods is suddenly going to spring up a single family home, but especially with say like downtown parking lots, it becomes much more attractive to use a site if you reduce the cost of investing in the site. So in some ways, what we're doing, especially with a downtown parking lot, is you are raising the option value on the property to redevelop. And I think that's been an important part of the overall picture of this, is talking to people who would otherwise just see a tax increase and say, look, there is something for you in this, and there are new options that this will unlock.
I have a somewhat related question to Henry's, which is why, to come back to some of the numbers that you showed, Jay, at the beginning, why is there so much speculation in Detroit? Like, what is it that those people think is going to happen in the future in the locations where they're holding those parcels? Like, it looked on that map like, I'm guessing people are holding parcels in places where like 10, 15, 20 years from now, like, it's not going to be booming. It's not going to be your big opportunity to like make money off a gentrifying neighborhood or.
I think there's been evidence that this is a successful strategy. I mean, there's certain areas of the city near downtown, Corktown, that's where we had Old Michigan Central Depot. It had been vacant and one of the national sites of urban port that was broadcast, and Ford bought it and put their tech center in there. That neighborhood they skyrocketed in value in housing. There were lots of properties there 10 years ago you could have, and lots of them were bought by speculators, and still some are still owned by speculators. Around Stellantis plant, when Stellantis decided to put their investment in the plant, that caused a number of people to be able to have that value of that, and it's just not expensive to do. This, I think, we look at the fact that you're raising the taxes as a disincentive for holding. I think not every neighborhood lot is going to be the new place we're going to build infill housing or multifamily housing. At least it provides the cut. To me, it's more important than the increase, because it really provides some more incentive to build, because there's less cost to build. And so that makes some interest too, that now I have some incentive for people coming to my speculative lots to be able to buy.
Before the next question, I just want to, Jenny, but I want to ask to make sure that we get this on the record. So, like, what is the status of this plan? Can someone answer that? Like, and like, if it were to be implemented, when would that happen?
Well, it's I'm impatient now because it took us a year to kind of get it right. So we put it in the legislature.
And it has to be approved by the legislature?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's the steps required. We had to get a bill introduced in the legislature. We did in September or so. We were hoping to get the first House passage this year. They've left for the year for a number of reasons, and so are taking it up in January. We plan to hopefully by spring to have the legislature have passed it. Under Michigan Constitution, any new local tax needs voter approval, so we'll have to go for voter approval in November.
And voter of just the city voters?
City voters.
Okay.
City voters. And then with the intent that we'll prepare during the year for the hope that it will be successful, since 97% of people get a tax cut, so we're giving the cuts in the right places. We would implement in 25.
So potentially a November 24 vote, assuming you get the passage in the legislature. Okay.
It's interesting to me that the places in the US that talk about doing a split roll tax are relatively inexpensive places with a bunch of vacant land. Because urban economists teach the land value tax as a way to encourage higher intensity development where land is expensive, right? So like, I live in DC, we've got parts of the city where, a half acre of lot is worth more than $1 million, and it's a single family house with a bunch of yard, right? Which is essentially wasted space when you could put a lot more productive uses on it. Do you have a sense of why, whether it's the politics, like why is it that it's Pittsburgh and Detroit talking about land value tax and not, California, reversing Prop 13 would effectively be a land value tax on long-term homeowners, but the expensive places are not talking about this.
Well, I'll just say in Michigan, the surprise to us, we went on with a bill that said anyone can use it, any city in the state. For a number of reasons, I think that got people concerned because of lack of understanding. So we said, we don't care, make it Detroit only. Well, then Ann Arbor said, wait, we want it too. So there can't be two more polar opposite communities within 50 miles of each other, the Detroit and Ann Arbor. Detroit's interest is very different than Ann Arbor's. Ann Arbor's is more the traditional, as we talked about. For other communities, they want to get lower parking lots and more housing and more EDUs and things like that. So they have a different plan for the city than Detroit does.
I can add to that too, because I did a little work for the DC Tax Reform Commission. I'm looking at what a split rate would look like there. And I think that the interesting thing there is that residents are sitting on very different amounts of land value as a component of the total value of the property, right? So if you just implement a straight split rate system where you lower taxes on building, raise taxes on lands, it's very different across neighborhoods. And that leads to a lot of instability. It's actually quite equitable. The deepest reductions are in some of the lowest value neighborhoods in the city. It would do a lot to improve racial equity in DC. I don't think it's viable necessarily on that model. And so if you were to, some of this has been limited by thinking only in terms of split rate. I think there are opportunities to find ways to employ a land value tax for the effects that it has on density, but to make a lot more people feel like this is a really good thing for the city.
Can this be done within a smaller jurisdiction within a city, like, I don't know, something analogous to a special taxing district? If you had a certain area where there's a lot of land banking, but not in the rest of the city, for instance?
I'd actually turn to Joan on that. Do you know of examples where a small jurisdiction is used?
Well, it would depend. There could be ways to do that, and as in the case of Detroit, you might have to go to the legislature to get approval. There was interest in Hartford a few years ago, and the thing that was so surprising was that in their downtown, they were taxing buildings more than land. So I don't know what the legal background was there, but clearly they had some ability to have different tax rates in different parts of one jurisdiction. So it wouldn't be unprecedented, though it might need to get legislative approval.
So I note that the Michigan model is different than what you've heard of around the country for split tax, mainly because it's built on a revenue neutral presumption. So that it's not additive, so that certain areas would see an increase. And so other communities in Michigan were very interested in this, and some way when they understand it better, a petition to be included. But whatever you're decreasing in the value of improvements, especially on residential, you make up on the tax on land. So that has an incidence effect significantly on non-residential property. And what we've encouraged other communities is look at it, but you gotta hire Nick Allen to be able to understand how does this really affect your taxpayers. And through Nick, we've done exhaustive study of the city where it seems like he knows every taxpayer and every LLC they own. And they understand pages and pages of this is this impact of this taxpayer and this taxpayer, which kind of informed us exactly how far we could go with the program.
I hopefully not engaging in free association here, but it seems like a cousin is the vacancy tax. A cousin to this might be considered the vacancy tax, which has been approved by both hot marketplaces like Berkeley and other places like Buffalo are looking at it. And so for any of you, I know this is sort of at one step removed, but does a vacancy tax work? Are there perils to that? Does it spur development and, as it will work against speculation?
I think vacancy taxes tend to be much more popular because nobody likes a vacant lot, right? They are also disproportionate, right? So they basically condition the tax on the property according to use. They don't tend to raise a lot of revenue, and the funny thing about it is, the more you tax vacancy in a high value location, you tend to reduce the amount that you could gain from it. So you might do it for that purpose. I just wouldn't use it as a way to raise revenue.
And remember, our purpose is to lower residential property taxes too, and you're not gonna produce enough revenue to be able to do the tax cut we really wanna see, which is part of the program to make, to lower the barriers to entry for residents.
And there's always the question of line drawing. I know DC has different tax rates and a higher tax rate for a vacant property, but they've had to continually change. How long can you say you have the property under development? How long can you be thinking about it? What's a family crisis? And that's difficult. And Mayor de Blasio at one point recommended a vacant property tax in New York, and the Times was interviewing taxpayers, and this man said, "This is not vacant. This was a terrible, dilapidated piece of land next to me, and now I've made it beautiful. The city should be paying me to beautify the city."
Time for one or two more.
So for those properties that are like end up being like $25, $60 a year, how much will those be now under the new tax system?
Well, for the average vacant residential lot, it would pay about $25-30 million a year, and it'd be tripling, doubling of residential, a doubling of that under the program. Remember, we figure out what the millage rate is for vacant for land as a residual for how much we cut of improvements, and that in 2022, based on our homestead, our land versus improvement values, will produce a tax rate of about 118 mils on land extra.
Yes, I guess just picking up on that and to Ron's point, let's say this program is unbelievably successful and the number of vacant lots drops precipitously. Does that mean that you wouldn't then be able to back out a value of the land? Because producing it the way that you do it is by looking at the sales of vacant lots.
Well, if 110,000 vacant lots can rebuild, I hope that also rebuilds assessment capacity in the city. And increasingly modern methods of assessment to look at residual land valuation and this kind of surface modeling approaches that are being pioneered at the Lincoln Institute.
We'll have the answer by then.
But I really want to emphasize that that's not the benchmark of success here. I think the benchmark of success is a lower rate of housing loss and migration out of the city. And the more that happens, and the more that this stabilizes things for residents in the city and people who have continued to invest and sustain their neighborhoods, that to me is the benchmark of that would be victory in this proposal.
All right, I think we can give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you very much.